Hey everyone, it's Rob. Welcome to the Do Nothing Pod, a special series on leading with compassion. And today I'll be speaking with Dr. Vinh Tho, who is the former director of the Gross National Happiness Center in Bhutan. He's also the founder of the Eurasia Foundation and Eurasia Learning Institute for Happiness and Wellbeing. He's a Buddhist teacher in the Vietnamese Zen tradition. He was ordained by Zen master Thich Nhat. He has his Ph.D. in psychology and education from Geneva University. He's the author of several books, many articles, and an international speaker on happiness and well-being as a new development paradigm. Dr. Tho was such a great guest. I know you're going to enjoy and learn so much from our conversation today. I always look for nuggets, and you're going to find many in our hour-long conversation. And it couldn't have come at a better time. With everything happening in the world, I think he brings a great perspective for us all to be thinking about. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Tho. Dr. Tho, it's so good to see you today in Switzerland. How's your day been?
Actually, it was wonderful. The sun is shining. We've had an amazingly beautiful spring day. And I went for a long walk next to the Geneva Lake for about an hour and a half or 2 hours. So yeah, I feel fresh and all is good.
How important is it for us to get out and move and be in the air? And if we have if we're fortunate enough to be able to walk around a lake or be in nature, certainly wonderful. But how important is that to us in our
with nature is really one of the sources of well-being and good health. Obviously, we all know that also enough physical exercise is also very important, especially during the time we're living through now, where we spend a lot of time in front of our screens. So it becomes even more important to balance the time we have on screen at the time we have in nature. So that's the one side, that it's important for our own health and well-being. The second side is that we all know how crucial it is to protect our environment, our beautiful and fragile planet. And I really believe that in order to really be able to feel responsible for the planet and for nature, we have to have a real personal connection with it. So I think it's not enough to look at research papers and know, the physics of it or the biology of it and know statistics about how important it is to protect the nature and the environment. But if we actually spend time in nature and get to feel the gratitude for the beauty, for the wonders of, a blue sky, a green tree, a beautiful lake, fresh air, then it becomes very personal. And if it becomes very personal, then it's much easier to feel responsible. It's very difficult to feel responsible for someone or something that we don't know, where we have no connection. So if our care for nature is purely intellectual, I doubt that it will easily change our behavior. But if we feel a heart connection to nature, then it becomes quite natural that we want to protect what we love. So these are the two sides.
Yeah. There's a quote from the Dalai Lama that I like very much, which is, if you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. I'm curious what your thoughts are around why leading with compassion, especially in this, I'll call it a new world, so to speak, is so important to our future.
So I think it's easy to connect what we just said about nature to leadership in general. Because again, you can only have compassion with beings, not with things. Therefore, if we want to develop compassion towards nature and all living beings, we have to develop a connection with nature and all living beings. Now, if we apply that to our relationship with other people, let's say in our team or in our organization or clients or our friends and family and so on, I believe that compassion is really dependent on creating this kind of heart-to-heart connection. And not seeing the other person just as an object or someone that is useful for my own purposes, but really acknowledging the other person's reality, their well-being or their quest for happiness is as legitimate as my own. So compassionate leadership begins with our ability to create a deep connection with others. And one of the key to deep connection is deep listening, listening in an empathic, compassionate way. So if we observe ourselves, we can notice that more often than not, unfortunately, even though we seem to be listening, while we are listening, we have many thoughts, we have our own ideas, we are already thinking about the reply we're going to give, we're judging what is being said, you know, if it meets our own ideas and opinions, then we might agree, and if it's different, we will disagree without further listening, and so on and so forth. So our ability to listen deeply depends on our ability to creating a space, inner space of stillness. So compassion with others starts with, and care for others begins with self-care, our ability to create this space of peace, of silence within ourselves that then creates the ability to listen deeply, respectfully, non-judgmentally. And this, in my view, is the very foundation of compassion.
Mm. How can one cultivate that skill?
Again, I think there are two sides to it. There's something that one has to practice for oneself. And it begins with slowing down and stopping. So most of the time, we're so busy and our lives have become so busy and the rhythm of our life has become so fast that slowing down and stopping is a real challenge for many of us. And I would say that was, I'm aware it's not for all of us, but for some of us, the actual Corona crisis was an opportunity to slow down and to stop. For those of us who had the opportunity to slow down and to stop, it might have been a deep experience to really look inward and put our attention inward rather than our attention being constantly stimulated through outer circumstances, outer inputs, outer stimuli. So slowing down and stopping and coming back to ourselves, being truly present, listening to ourselves, whether it is through practices of mindfulness, meditation, physical exercise. So various people will find various tools that is more fits better to them. It might be a quiet walk in the forest, or, you know, there's so many ways, but really basically it's bringing mind and body together in whatever form and means, so that we are truly present and that we can start to observe what happens in my body, what happens in my breathing, what happens in my mind, what happens in my own emotions. And too often we're not really aware how we actually feel, what actually happens to us. So I think that's the one side. Really, it's coming back to ourselves, slowing down and looking inward. And again, this enables us with a little bit of practice to create an open space of silence, of availability, of listening, that we can then use. I mean, it's use in a deep sense. I mean, that becomes available when we interact with others. And it's very interesting to try to observe ourselves while we are interacting with others, and to observe, how am I listening? So there are many different kinds of listening. There's a listening that is very superficial, that is not a true listening. Like, for instance, when you observe like people having an argument, they just listen enough to be able to respond and find a better argument than the other one, right? But it's not true listening. You're not really interested in what the other is. So that's the most like shallow level. Then you can have a kind of a factual listening. You at least you hear what the other is saying. So that's already a step further than, you know, this sort of shallow pretense listening. It's a factual listening, which we would do, for instance, when we're doing scientific research or conducting an interview as a journalist or something like that. At least we are attentive to the facts, and we are willing to take in even facts that might contradict our personal opinion, because we're just open and try to listen, you know. And then later we can decide whether we agree or not. And then there's a third level, which is even deeper, which is like what you could call empathic listening or compassionate listening, where you listen not only to what is said, but also to what is not said. And you listen to out of what is being spoken. What is the emotional quality? What is the intention that is not necessarily formulated in words, but actually gives the deeper meaning to what is said. And when this happens, then we get a feeling of being in communion with one another. So observing ourselves in our daily interactions and observing, right now I'm really listening, or, well, you know, I'm sort of listening, but not fully, and so on and so forth. This is a practice that can be done all day long, and it doesn't require to put time aside or something. We can do it while we're working.
Currently in the United States, there's been quite a bit of rioting. And I was thinking about compassion and how those that feel uncertainty or potentially uncared for or not heard, how can those that maybe haven't had the opportunity to think about things in the way that you're stating them at this moment, what are some simple things, maybe if it is simple, that they can do to recognize what's happening in their response to it?
Yeah, first of all, I would really like to share my sympathy and care and love for all the people in the United States. I know it's a very difficult moment that people are experiencing right now in many places. So I really would like to extend my deep sympathy and wishes that as a nation you can heal and start a real dialogue. And I think that's one of at the same time, that's one of the key points that, of course, I'm looking from outside as a foreigner being abroad and so on, but a feeling that I'm getting is that it seems to have become very difficult to have a true dialogue. People have very polarized perspectives, and there's a kind of a difficulty to acknowledge that other people's perspective might have some kind of legitimacy. So there's a kind of a hardening of the positions, like we are right and they are wrong, but for the other side is exactly the same. We are right and they're wrong. So, and I think without compassionate dialogue is very difficult to heal. This being said, it doesn't condone any act that is morally unjust, like violence, destruction, disrespect for others, minority or whoever. And obviously, I totally understand that what happened with the death of George Floyd has created a lot of sadness and anger and so on and so forth, and it's totally understandable. Yet at the same time, if we demonize the other side, like feeling that, oh, you know, they're hardly human, they're monsters, kind of, they're like heartless brutes or something, this won't help. So I recall, when, I'm half Vietnamese and I'm from the war generation, and in Vietnam, of course, we had a situation that was a civil war. It was partly a war with America, but it was also a civil war, and likewise the country was deeply divided, and it was very difficult for people to listen to one another, and there was a feeling on both sides that the others were really mean or evil. And there was one event that happened a little bit after the war that really touched me deeply. So for the elders among us, might remember that after the war, many Vietnamese fled Vietnam on boats, the so-called boat people, and quite a few came to the US. And regularly some boats were attacked by pirates. And when they were attacked by pirates, many people died. Most of the women got raped and so on. And so my teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, had organized boats to try to, take people up in their boats and bring them to safety. And then we heard that one of the refugee boats had been attacked by pirates. And a little girl who was 12 years old had been raped by the pirates and then had thrown herself in the water because she could not bear it. And then my teacher composed a poem to share his compassion with the little girl. But in this poem, he also shares his compassion with the pirate, saying that it's too easy to take sides. Of course, we know who the victim is. There's no doubt, right? The little girl is the victim, and it's very natural that our heart should go out to her, and it should. But we should not forget that on the other side, the pirate is also the product of society, of circumstances. He was not born as a rapist, as a murderer. Circumstances created the pirate. And so he also deserves compassion. Although it's much more difficult for us to feel compassion with the perpetrator. So I think it's really about that, on one hand, really engaging for those who are victims of injustice and speaking out and really supporting them and not allowing injustice to take place. On the other hand, not simply demonizing those who we perceive as perpetrators, but trying to understand what has created this hatred or this violence, and have compassion with that and try to reach out to the human in them, to the good heart in them. So that would really, for me, be the key. How can we, on the one hand, reach out to the victims, support the victims, stand up against injustice, and so on and so forth, speak out, speak truth to power. On the other hand, also not completely despise those that we perceive as the perpetrators, but try to reach out to them too.
In a way, understanding that they had circumstances in their lives that led to their actions, and we're not aware of what those are, but just the acknowledge that is their journey, and doing our best to have compassion for that person. Thank you. It's not an easy thing to do, but it's a really wonderful practice. What is your definition of happiness?
My understanding of happiness has evolved over time. For 7 years, I was in Bhutan, working in Bhutan as the director of the Gross National Happiness Center, and in Bhutan, happiness is kind of the development paradigm of the country. And so when I took up this position as director of the Gross National Happiness Center, I really tried to understand in a deeper way. So we all have a kind of a spontaneous, idea of happiness. Everybody somehow understands that, but it's often quite unreflective. It's more like a bit superficial. So for me, there are two sides to it. First one is that when we speak of happiness, potentially we speak of two very different things. The first dimension of happiness is more like related to pleasure, to pleasant experiences, to good mood, smiley, enjoying, which is of course important and nice. And as human beings, we all want to have happy moments. But of course, it's very personal, because each one of us enjoys other things. Like, for instance, you might, enjoy a very good wine, and for you drinking a very nice Bordeaux or something is a moment of pleasure, deep pleasure. Or you might be completely abstinent, and if somebody offers you a glass of wine, you're embarrassed because you don't know how to say no, because actually you don't drink anything. So forth, Or I love hiking in the mountains. Yeah. And once I had my little niece coming from Vietnam, and the first weekend she was here in Switzerland. I said, okay, let's go for a hike. So we took the car, went to the base of the mountain, and then I said, okay, you see that summit over there? We're going to climb up there. And she said, and once we're up there, what are we going to do? I said, well, we'll have a little picnic, then we'll go back down. She said, well, we could have the picnic right here. So for her, it was like beyond our understanding. Why should we walk and strain ourselves for 2-3 hours to go up? Because in the end, we'll just go back down. So just to say that, for each one of us, it's very different what we like and what, and for me, like walking in the mountain is just a huge pleasure. I love it. I feel fantastic. And that's legitimate. And we certainly don't want the government or the institution or the organization to tell us what we should like and not like. That's very personal and legitimately so. That's the one side of happiness. The other side of happiness, and this side is connected with what the ancient Greek called hedonia. Hedonia, or like hedonism, like pleasure, pleasure of life. The other side of happiness has more to do with a long-lasting, meaningful life. So it's not so much the up and down that every one of us will have during the day, moments where you feel better, and then, for some reason, if you don't feel so good, it might be physiological, like, your sugar level has gone down and you feel a bit exhausted or whatever, So that's just the up and downs of natural emotions. So that's not what we're speaking about. But the question is, what are the conditions, the enabling conditions that will allow everyone, hopefully everyone, to have a good, meaningful, happy life? So that's this kind of happiness that we're looking at when we're speaking, for instance, as happiness as a development paradigm, right? And this has three components, three main components. This sort of happiness, this deeper form of happiness. The first one is to live in harmony with oneself, to be aligned with oneself, meaning that, is the life I'm leading an expression of my deepest values, of my highest aspiration? Do I feel at ease with it? Do I feel that I'm making a contribution, that what I do is worthwhile, and so on and so forth? So, I feel that there's an alignment between what is deep down in my heart or in my mind and what I'm actually doing. So that's the first very important dimension of happiness, right? That is feeling of alignment, of integrity, of coherence. That would be the first component. The second component has to do with my relationship with others. And that, again, links back to what we spoke about before, compassion, listening, and so on and so forth. Because we all know that the quality of our human relationships determines to a great extent our well-being. So, we've probably all experienced that. Let's say we were on holiday, it was a beautiful place. Let's say you're on the beach and the sun is shining and you're in a nice hotel and the food is good and all the rest of it. Then the sea is clean. And then you're with your partner or your friend, and then you have an argument. And then you start, quarreling. And suddenly all the beauty has disappeared, right? Because the quality of human interaction is so dominant in our feeling of well-being that, never mind the nice beach and hotel and the food, if I don't feel, that I have a good relationship with my partner or friend or whoever it is, then it spoils the whole thing. So really the quality of human relationship is the second fundamental dimension of happiness. And there was this long Harvard research on adulthood and aging, where also one of the main findings was that when people look back at their life, what really determines the feeling of happiness and fulfillment is not the position, it's not the income, it's not, none of that, but it's really the quality of human relationship. Being it in a family, friends, whatever, it doesn't matter what kind of circle, but we need as human beings to feel integrated, to feel part of a community, to feel, cared for, and that we care for others. So that's really the second dimension of happiness. And the third one has really to do with our relationship with nature, which we spoke about at the very beginning of this talk. And this dimension has become more and more important because of the challenge, ecological challenge we're living in. So I think if we don't manage to live in harmony with nature, well, there will be no happiness left anyway.
Mm-hmm.
For none of us. So these are really for me the three main components: living in harmony with oneself, living in harmony with others and our society and our social context, and living in harmony with nature. Mm-hmm. And this again has two sides. One is what is a conducive environment that enables that, and that's, in my view, a social responsibility, a responsibility that should be shared by state and organization and so forth. And the other side is more the inner dimension, what I would call happiness skills, which is more individual responsibility.
When you share those three, I was thinking a bit about interconnectedness and how we're all so interconnected. And how are we doing with that in our world society?
I think there's a kind of a paradox in which we live, because on one hand, with globalization, the interconnectedness of the whole planet has become very obvious, and the pandemic has made it very visible. You know, it started somewhere in China, Wuhan. Who cares about Wuhan? You know, if you're not Chinese, it's like, oh, poor them, but so what? You know, it has nothing to do with me, and within weeks or months, it was all over the world, right? So we realized, oh my God, we are really interdependent. And then when it was about, for instance, having the gears we needed, the safety, the masks, and so on and so forth, then we realized, oh, but the whole production chain is worldwide. So if it collapses in China, then you might have no masks in the US or in Europe or whatever. So interconnectedness is a biological reality, beginning with the fact that we are all breathing the same air. Right now, you're in the US, I'm in Switzerland. It might seem far away, and it seems like, oh, it's not exactly the same air, but in the end it is. We only have one atmosphere for the whole planet, right? So if you pollute your air, well, sooner or later I will have breathing problems, right? If I pollute the air here, sooner or later you will have a breathing problem. So we really are objectively, biologically, economically, and so on, interconnected. And I would say the paradox is that on the one hand, we know it. For instance, you were mentioning the challenges that you are facing in the US right now. And of course, we in Europe are following it in real time. It's not that in the past it would have taken very long before we know what happens in the US. Now we know it as soon as you know it, we know it too. So information is global and so on. Yeah. So that's a reality, but we have not fully taken, realized what it means. So, and we see, strangely enough, nationalism coming up very strongly, not only in the US, but in many, many countries, like very nationalistic governments coming up saying, us, it's for us, it's just about my country or whatever, and this kind of collective egoism from groups, like whites or blacks or Americans or Mexicans or Muslim or Hindu or whatever, like dividing in whatever groups. And of course, there are many groups into which you can divide mankind, you men and women, and old and young, and all the rest of it. But in the end, if we don't reach to what is common to all of us, so our fundamental humanity, there's no way we're going to find solutions for the problems that we are facing, because these problems are mankind problems. There's nothing that can be solved just in one country or through one religion or one race or whatever group. So I think the challenge is that on one hand, this interconnectedness is already a reality, but in our consciousness, we have not yet integrated it. We still live as we used to feel in the times of tribes that were separated, and my tribe against your tribe, whatever my tribe is, you know. So I think that's a very big challenge that we need to match with in the evolution of our understanding, our consciousness, of our feeling, that which is already a reality, that interconnectedness is not an ideology or an opinion, it's just a reality of the world. Mm-hmm. But we don't live up to it yet. And that's, I think, one of the big challenge that we learn to live up as one mankind.
In Bhutan, when you were implementing gross national happiness, how would you work with the disparity amongst society? So how could you focus on those that maybe didn't have as much, and those that had plenty?
Well, that's exactly the reason why gross national happiness begins with an index and a survey. Because what we measure, what we count, counts. Because what we count is where we focus our attention. So as long as we measure the development of a country by measuring in the first place GDP, gross domestic product, so our attention is focused on financial transaction. And these financial transactions might be beneficial or detrimental. Let's say if there's a war raging somewhere, all the countries that are weapon producers will have their GDP increase. And that's like US and Germany and France and Israel and so on and so forth. So all the weapon producers, for them, war is a good news, because it means it's a growth of GDP. Or another example is if you have a natural catastrophe, like a big oil spill, because it's very expensive to clean it up, it will raise the GDP. And therefore, and on the other hand, all the human activities that are not connected with financial transactions will not be counted. So if you would count, for instance, the number of hours of work done for free by parents in a household, you know, taking care of the children, cleaning, and so on and so forth, just household work, right? These are like millions and millions of hours of voluntary work, but that are not counted, therefore don't appear in a GDP measurement. So let's imagine, to make it more simple, or more concrete, imagine that a family decides that both parents will work a little less, so they have more time for the children. They will educate their children in a better way, they have more time. Probably the family will be more harmonious and happier. But this is a loss from a GDP perspective. Now imagine the same parents decide that the most important thing for them is to earn as much as possible. They will completely be involved in their work, no time for the kids, so they have to hire a nanny. And then maybe the kids will not be so well because they have so little interaction with their parents. They will have to go and see a psychologist, and so they have to pay the psychologist, and so on and so forth. All that is very good for GDP. So you see, so happiness and so the increasing of happiness and the increasing of financial transaction GDP is not necessarily correlated. It can be correlated. Let's say a family doesn't have enough to eat, and then they earn more, and then they have enough to eat. Then there's a correlation between increasing of income and well-being. But in other cases, there's no correlation. And so many things that are so important in our life are not connected with financial transactions. So if, let's say, you have a problem and you have a good friend, and you can go and see your friend and share with him or her, It doesn't cost you anything, but it's very precious. But if you don't have friends, you have to go and see a shrink. So you have to pay. So it's better for GDP. But for you, it's probably better if you have a friend, right? And so you could multiply the examples, but it's easy to understand. So what we count counts. So we need to look at the development of a society or of a business or of an organization, not purely from a perspective of financial transaction, but we have to have a holistic, and this is what gross nationalist happiness is about. It's a 9-domain indicator system to measure. So in Bhutan, I didn't forget your question, I'm just making a little bit of a detour. So in Bhutan, what we do is every 3 years we make a big survey, and it enables us to measure all the different dimensions that have an impact on the well-being of the people. So of course, finances is one, but it's only one of 9. Then you have other things like health and education and community vitality and ecology and psychological well-being and so on and so forth. So there are many other dimensions. So you measure that, all that. And then you come up with results. And these results give you a pretty comprehensive picture of where your society is at. So you might see that, to respond to your question with the haves and have not, it's not always that simple, because for instance, in Bhutan, in the countryside, in villages, the financial income is very, very little, very, very modest. But there are very positive factors, since it's like very strong community vitality, very strong cultural life, very strong religious beliefs. So they have other things, right? And in the city, when people move from the countryside to the city, then probably their income will rise. They have a better income, but they lose other things like community vitality, social support, culture, religion, like that. So it's not, so the have and have not are in both sides. So for the people in the countryside, the question is, how can you help them have a better income? How you can help them having maybe activities that will, give them a better income through maybe diversifying of the production, things like that. And for people in the city, the question might not be in the first place a question of income, but maybe a question of how do we create, how do we build cities that are fostering a more community life, and, so that's the thing. When you have a comprehensive picture of your society or your organization or your business, then you can answer in a very differentiated way and not think that throwing money at the problem is always the answer. Sometimes it's the answer, but sometimes not at all.
I read that, and if I got this wrong, please correct me. I read that you believe that changing the educational system and the way businesses work are 2 of the strongest leverage points that we can use to transform society. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Let me begin with education. So if we want to have a lasting change in society, I believe that education is the strongest leverage point, because obviously the way we educate our children and young people, that will have a lasting impact on society in the years to come. This is a very obvious thing. Now, if we look at the current education system, by and large, worldwide, is not that different, because the current education system is a reflection of the current economic system. So for instance, one of the assumption of the current economic system is that competition is the best way to improve economy. And we project the same idea on education. We think that competition is the best way to increase learning, right? So tests and, and who has the highest marks. And if you want to go to a good college, you have to, have really high marks and so on. So it creates a certain mindset that your friends are actually your competitors. They are not. It's not a feeling of solidarity that we're in it together. It's like, okay, I have to make sure I have better marks than my neighbor, otherwise he or she will get into college and I might, not be able to. So this kind of mindset begins very early, competition, right? Rather than cooperation, solidarity, and like that. That's the one thing. The second thing is our educational system is focusing on intellectual dimension, academic dimension, which are important. Obviously, we need to know how to read and to write and to count, and we have to. I'm not saying anything against academic knowledge and intellectual knowledge, but the intellect alone is not enough. So we know from many research that, for instance, emotional intelligence is a better predictor of success than intellectual capability. So IQ versus EQ, right? IQ, intellectual quotient, is not as strong a predictor of success than EQ, emotional intelligence. But this education system is focused on the intellectual, on the IQ dimension. And the EQ is left more or less to chance. So if you're lucky, you have a good family or you have good friends, you might develop it. If not, so be it. Mm-hmm. So I think that the education of the heart, EQ, if you want, should be really balanced with the intellectual education. And the third dimension is the hands. So, you know, our ability to do. So we see, and some people have experienced it now in this time of coronavirus, where people could not rely on services coming from outside. Many of us are completely helpless. We don't know how to you know, I have a Ph.D, but if something is broken in my house, if nobody comes to repair it, I'm sort of completely helpless, right? Because my Ph.D. didn't help me in knowing how to fix a broken sink or the heater or anything like that. So you know, like developing a balanced education where the head, the heart, and the hand are all three educated, so people can think. Of course, very important to know how to think and to be intelligent, but then to have a good heart, to develop compassion, to, you know, and know how to create good relationships, to be compassionate and so on. And then to have practical skills, to know how to, you know, to grow fruits or vegetables, and how do you, to be able to do woodwork or whatever, but, you know, you have to have hands that work, you know. Mm-hmm. So that's, I think, a starting point. That's why we developed both in Bhutan and then in Vietnam. Now we're also doing that in Europe, what we call Happy Schools program that try to develop in a holistic way, so that children and young adults can learn in a holistic way. And I believe that's a very strong leverage point for transformation of society, because when you look at it, the social systems, economic system, political system, and so on, are not natural laws, and they're also not God-given. We made them, so we can transform them. But in order to transform them, we have to transform our mind, because they are the product of our mind, of what we think, how we feel, what we do. So if we don't change our mindset, you can make all kind of you know, you can make a revolution, you can change, elect a different president, you can do whatever you want. It won't really have long-lasting changes, because it's the collective consciousness who's creating society. It's not someone alone, you know, even if it's a president or a CEO, or him or her alone doesn't create society. It has an impact on society, but it, you know, the society is a collective creation. So by changing the educational system, we can hope to create a better, a juster, more inclusive, more humane, and more ecological society. Mm. That's the educational part. The business part is, we all know that the economy is the leading force in our society. So, of course, government is very important, but still, the economy is really a major actor in society. And in a way, I believe that there is a stronger possibility to transform the economy. Is, in a way, it might sound strange, but I believe it's in a way easier to transform the economic system than the political system. Why? Because an entrepreneur has a certain freedom. Yeah, so if you're an entrepreneur and you have a company, of course, you might have shareholders and you might have a board and all that. You're not 100% free, but still, you can really give a direction. You can give an impulse. You can, and we worked with big companies. I worked with the largest energy company in Thailand. Now I'm working with the largest energy company in Western Switzerland, Service Industriel de Genève. It's the Geneva energy company. and so on. So I've worked with, and I still work with many companies, and I saw it happening that, when the leadership of a company decides, okay, we really want to change something, they can do it. While politicians are much more trapped in a system, like they have their electors and they have to satisfy their electors. There are so many lobbies, and so it's cumbersome. It takes a long time to transform the the political system. But in the economic field, I'm not saying that you have total freedom, but there is a certain amount of freedom, and we can see it from many companies. We also work, for instance, with Aileen Fisher. You might know her. She's a New York-based clothing company. Mm-hmm. Aileen came to Bhutan, did a program with us, and when she came back to the US, she started this new vision for a company with circular economy and 100% ecological and so on and so forth. So she could do it. She just decided, okay, I'll do it. And she's been economically very successful. It's not that it was either she's doing good on a human level, but not good financially. It's not either or. When you look at her company, you see that she's very successful as a company, and she's really a force for the good in the business world. So that's why I believe that there's a real potential for, and I believe that many entrepreneurs actually are people who want to make a positive contribution to society. Of course, you might have a few greedy, immoral people among them, like everywhere, but the majority of people who, really have this entrepreneurship in them, they have somehow an impulse to bring something to society. And sometimes this impulse gets lost because this prevalence of only profit orientation can somehow, have a negative impact on this original impulse. But many, many business people that I've met and that I still work with, I feel when they get a chance to transform their company in such a way that it can be a force for the good, they're more than happy to do it. And all the employees are very happy about it and get much more engaged, because if you work for a paycheck, well, that's good, better than nothing. But if on top of your paycheck, you have the feeling I'm contributing something positive to society, the engagement is much, much stronger.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, in many cases, from what I've seen, it actually helps you with your results. So it all works together. And another person that you mentioned, which we're looking forward to speaking with next week, is Cindy Vu, who is the CEO of Buddhist, a very large shoe company with, I think, 8,000 or 9,000 employees in Vietnam. And I think her program's called Happiness. And you worked with her, and I'm really looking forward to hearing how she has implemented that at the company at such a grand scale. As we close, I'm curious, when you have your moments of solitude and maybe you're doing a hike in the mountains, what are some of your hopes and some of the things you might be thinking about as we move forward into this new world that we have, and how it might look in the future?
So my view is that I think there's a little bit, we have to find a middle way between two extremes. One extreme would be now that gradually the corona crisis is slowly overcome. So I know in the US you're not there quite yet, but here in Switzerland we've already started deconfining, and things are coming more or less back to normal. So there's, in this phase, there are two pitfalls to avoid. One would be, okay, so we have to go back to normal. And by normal, we mean the situation that was before. So I believe that would be a mistake, because the situation as it was before created the crisis in which we are. And it was an opportunity for many, at least, to, as I mentioned before, to slow down, to stop, to reflect, and to try to think what really matters in our life. So going back to the way it was before, I think would be a mistake. Now, hoping that everything will change overnight would be an illusion. And if we have this illusion, we might be very disappointed because obviously it's a slow process. If we just hope, okay, so everything's going to be different from next month on, then we might get discouraged and cynical. So anyway, we can't do anything because, look, it doesn't work. So what is the middle path between not going back to the old normal, creating a new normal, if you want, and also not having the illusion that everything is going to be totally radically different tomorrow? And so I think it's a matter of what are the intentions that we are carrying as our priorities. So I really strongly believe in the power of intention. So I think individually and collectively, as an organization, as a company, as a group of friends, whatever, we need to really come into a discussion. What are our main intentions? What would we say are the priorities for tomorrow? So that we have a clear vision where we want to, what is our goal? What do we want to reach? And then if we hold this intention, of course, we will meet with some resistance and challenges and so, but if our intention is clear, it will help us transform or, overcome the challenges or find a way around or something. And so for me, I would say I see a number. One intention that I hold very dearly is I hope that more and more people, companies, countries will start focusing on happiness and well-being rather than on profit and maximizing profit and financial growth. And through that, we'll understand that financial growth, technology, and so on are all very important things, but they are means to an end. They are not a goal in themselves. The new technology is not a goal. More money is not a goal. These are means, these are tools. But the goal should be happiness for all human beings and well-being for all life forms. And when I say all life forms, I mean animals and plants and rivers and forests and our planet, basically. Right? Mm-hmm. So if we would agree that, okay, our focus is we want to promote happiness for everyone. So it's an inclusive, there's not the haves. Of course, there will always be inequality, and that's sort of natural. I'm not saying we should all be equal, but nobody should be completely left out. So the attempt of inclusion, not equality, inclusion. So an inclusive society that strives to focus on the happiness of everyone and on the well-being of all life forms. That for me is the strongest intention that I hold as really what I would like to try to contribute in whatever modest way I can, being it through education, through working with business people, with government. Right now, we're also working with a state within Switzerland. So in Switzerland, we call it canton. It's like a state in the US. It's much smaller than a US state, but still, to help them implement gross national happiness at state level, if you want. So I think we can work in politics, we can work in non-for-profit, like NGOs, we can work in business, we can work in education, but we can all have this common goal. And always ask ourselves, what I'm doing, is it contributing to bringing more happiness and well-being to all? Or is it degrading happiness and well-being? And if we only have this very simple, like sort of North Star, if you want, that with this action, we ask ourselves, does it bring happiness to myself and to others? Or does it bring suffering to myself and to others? Then it's a relatively simple way to have a compass to guide our action. So that would really be my deepest intention.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And Dr. Tho, thank you so much for your time today. I'm so grateful. I know you're a busy person, and your wisdom will be transmitted out. And I hope there are many nuggets in here, and I hope those that are listening are able to grasp onto some of them and implement them in their lives, because you've certainly inspired us to take simple actions that can really make a big difference. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for having me on this talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much.